very much, and it's good to be with you. Just one or two words about myself. Some has been said. I'm York Dowson pastoral care advisor, so I'm an ordained Anglican priest, but I also counsel psychotherapists. So my role is really clergy support in the diocese, and Church of England. There's a fair amount of stress around at the moment, as you might imagine, with post-COVID and all the financial things and difficulties that are around, and reorganisations that are going on. So in the past, I've had parishes, I've done counselling in schools, and years ago worked in hospital microbiology before I changed direction. So that's a little about me. I was asked to talk about God and mental suffering. So that's, so before I come on to actually get going on that, I thought we'd just keep a moment of quiet and just still ourselves and begin with prayer. As a team we've prayed, but it'd be good to pray with everyone who's just arrived. So if we'll just be very still and be aware of your breath and bring yourself into the present moment with God. And recall Jesus' presence with us, and 2 or 3 are gathered together in his name. Lord Jesus, we ask you to be with us this morning in our talking and in our listening, in our thinking, in our hearts. We may be open to whatever you have for us today. Amen. Great. So before I get on to thinking about God, if you like, some more general thoughts. Start with a bit of biology, actually. At its simplest, this is physical pain, but actually mental pain as well, is the body and the mind telling us there's something wrong, either outside, this is very obvious stuff, for example, a burn, or inside, for example, of illness. I suffer from back trouble periodically, and so that's when I get a twinge, that's a message to me to kind of watch it. So go do a quick screen share. This is basically the cognitive behavioral model. So our early experiences, what we make of them, the scripts by which we live our lives, and then particular triggers. And this is thinking about mental pain, but it can be any other pains as well, physical triggers like pulling in muscle or whatever. And then what happens is then we get a set of thoughts going through our heads, and often we end up ruminating about it. So if that's physical pain, I've got toothache, I could be then thinking, oh, I think it's terrible, I'm ever going to get a dental appointment, so on and so forth. And that actually feeds both the physical and the emotional stuff. And actually in depression and anxiety, we get a lot of things going round and round in our heads, ruminations, thoughts. And then there's the emotions, which are often the part of that pain, the emotion of anxiety, the emotion of anger or of low mood, all sorts of the different moods we can get. And that's fed by the thoughts and feeds the thoughts. And then there's what we actually do, and some things help, maybe praying, seeking help, doing something about it, or sometimes some behaviors don't help, turning to drink, withdrawing from others, self-destructive behaviors. And then the physical reactions where we experience all this in our body. And these kind of feed each other. Sometimes the classic Cbt model is that the triggers start thoughts off. In reality, often with people, the first thing they're aware of can be the emotions or actually the physical side. Sometimes if I'm anxious, often what I'm first aware of it is actually that feeling in my stomach. And then that tells me there's something wrong. Then I'm aware that I'm anxious, and that comes, the aware of the thoughts and things comes later. But we get hooked in a loop. And so all physical pain and mental pain kind of interact. and there's a sort of holistic thing going on there. But so actually, in seeking to know what's going on and what's the point of this and making sense of it, I think it's helpful just to kind of link them up. And in terms of particularly how we respond to mental pain, there'll be our past, things that we've experienced in the past. If we've had trauma in our lives, that will make us more prone to anxiety or depression, or the early experiences we've had, or the kind of ways we've picked up and how to deal with life, how to respond to other people. Again, that will influence all this. And part of that, also that background thing, also will be our faith and where we are with God and how that feeds into this as well. So it's quite a complicated thing, but I suppose just the simple point is there's a lot of kind of interaction going on within us, and actually our relationships and all sorts of other things impinge as well. Also, in terms of, again, just a tiny bit of psychological background, in the pain that's mental in origin, some of that actually links to the very basic stuff in our brain about responding to threat, the fight, flight, freeze, flop, the so-called reptile brain. So again, it has a place in survival and surviving life. So anxiety and hypervigilance feel bad things, but actually they're gearing us up for something wrong, for threat. So coming and delivering a talk, I'll be feeling a bit anxious, and that's probably just as well I do, rather than being completely laid back and complacent about it. Or dealing with someone who's challenging, again, the anxiety actually focuses you, and there's a positive role in that. But all that can go wrong. Like we can become over anxious or oversensitized, and again, trauma and things feed into those things. But remembering, if you like, the positive side of some of these difficult emotions, I think it's quite helpful, because that's partly where's God in all this. Actually, there's something about these things they're there in their normal state to actually help us live life and to do what we need to do. But it's when if they become disproportionate or oversensitized that they become a problem. A bit more specifically onto mental pain, some of the key areas, I think you may want to add others, but for example, grief is one, the pain of loss and separation. Again, that's a very, stating the obvious, very painful, difficult thing to experience, but there is a positive side. Actually, it's about adjusting to loss. Even in the animal kingdom, it happens. Actually, there was I was preparing this, there was a documentary on cheetahs on the television, big cats, and one of them, when their little pup or kitten or whatever they are died, the parents just stayed with it, and the mother did, and there was a sense of just grief in that, and part of that was about adjusting to that loss before they could move on. And that's just part of in a weird way, that's part of our healing process, that going through that process of grief. And anxiety, I've already mentioned, actually that prepares us ready for action and to deal with stuff and to cope with stress. But it's when the problem often, which you'll no doubt other speakers will get onto later, is that short-term anxiety is fine. It's that long-term continuous anxiety, the stress, that mucks us up, because we're kind of geared to deal with things and move on. Whereas when we're just stuck in a constantly stressful, anxious situation, that's when it actually becomes quite harmful. Other forms of mental pain, obviously depression, low mood. It's sometimes harder to see what positive there is in that, but I think it's very basic. Feeling low and down is a sign that something needs to change in us and in our lives. So the pain alongside that, and again when it takes over, so sometimes it's a reactive depression to something in particular, and that again is a sign we need to respond to that. But there's that sort of depression that just comes up within people. Some people are predisposed to that, and that I think that's a harder one to explain any positives in. Psychosis would be another area, which in a sense is the mind, again, so you're more expert in this than me, I'm sure, but almost the mind going to overload. So to give an example of someone I've worked with in the past, this person had a period of psychosis. But before that, in his childhood, he'd suffered serious abuse. And then in adulthood, he'd been a kind of workaholic. He'd just spent his whole life working to kind of keep it at arm's length. And eventually it kind of caught up with him, and that was the psychosis. It just overwhelmed him. And then he had to kind of slow down and revisit that stuff and look at some of that, seek healing for that stuff in the past before he could then sort of return to normal life, if you like. So it was a kind of almost the mind just shutting him down. So for both from a biological and a faith perspective, it's thinking about what's the pain telling us, and where's God in all this? And another question, particularly for those of you working in health services, what can be done about it? And so part of obviously the physical responses in your professional lives, but there's also, how do we bring Christ's healing into this pain and suffering? And I think there's two areas there. One is meaning making. Going back to that initial CBT chart, the thoughts thing, actually part of how we make sense, how we make sense of things, what we draw out of it actually helps us cope with it and live with it, and sometimes actually lessens it. So obviously our faith and where we see Jesus and God in all that meaning making is really important. When people are ready to do that varies, obviously. Sometimes it's just a complete overwhelm and the meaning making comes later on. But nonetheless, at some point, that can be really important. So just being alongside to talk with people when they're ready for that. It's not one we can force on people, but I think it's often people give an opening when they're ready. And then the other way, which again I'm going to come back to at the end, is, in a sense, as Christians, we are called to bring Christ's healing, and also we're called in effect to be Christ, to be Christ's body with other people. So simply by our presence and who we are and our praying, we're bringing something of Christ into those situations. And often it's the quite little things, actually, speaking of someone who's been to hospitals and things, when you're kind of feeling, long time since I worked in that environment. So you go in as a patient, you just feel completely disorientated often and a bit overwhelmed by it all. And so someone who just takes you in hand. I remember years ago, we were on a holiday, and actually in Cyprus, and I'd had a minor operation before I went, and it got infected. So when I arrived, I got this horrible infection. And going into this hospital, I didn't speak the language. And this lady who sort of volunteered just took me in hand and took me where I needed to be. And for me at that moment, she was Christ. She just really, such a difference, just that presence and that, going the extra mile with me, literally around the corridors, for somewhere where I was completely disorientated and confused. So I think there's something about actually our presence and who we are really does, those little things can really make quite a huge difference. Anyway, coming back to my script, we're called to be Christ. Another source of pain, of course, is just simply the business of being human. We're finite, we age. As we get older, we get things related to bring us suffering and pain. My mother died last summer, and she had dementia at the end, which was pretty grim. And we die, and ultimately we die. And actually, for her, death was a release. For me, that also raises some ethical questions in terms of how long do we prolong life for? This is kind of, I know with my mother, I was quite conscious that as time, initially we'd signed this thing and we'd got power of attorney, medical power of attorney that, she would be treated, but she wouldn't be resuscitated. But there was a kind of subtle shift in that at the end. We weren't actually consulted, but the doctors kind of said, oh, actually, we won't be treating her now. And actually, that was the right thing. you know, she'd reached the end of her life and it was just that letting go. But I was conscious of them just doing it without really having the conversation or just telling us. So, so there are ethical and spiritual questions around, you know, where in terms of our faith, how long do we prolong life? How do we talk those issues through with people? I think some further questions for people of faith. Why does God allow pain and suffering? Where is God in pain? And one I've already raised is, what meaning or point can we find in pain? So what part can our faith play? I think there's many different forms of pain and suffering, so there's no one answer to the problem of suffering. Very often suffering, and some mental suffering, is a consequence of human free will and human evil. So in Genesis 1 and 2 and 3, the two creation accounts, human beings are created good. They have free will, and they can and they do make wrong choices. They are flawed. The image of God is there, but it's twisted within us. And so those choices we can make, which bring our suffering upon ourselves or others, they can range from quite relatively trivial things, people choosing to eat poor diets or live unhealthy lifestyles, taking risks, through to child abuse, people abusing others, misusing their power, through to kind of corporate things, the Grenfell Tower, where people's greed over and using of shoddy materials actually had a horrendous impact on those people in that flat. Or to what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. You know, I mean, Mr. Putin, the kind of living example of the old saying about power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But, you know, that his choices are having terrible impacts on literally millions of people. So that sense of making sense of it, about human evil and human free will. The positive side of free will, of course, is we can choose for good, we can choose for God, we can invite God in, and God's working under the surface all the time to move things to the right place, but often we choose against that. That itself leaves some questions. Someone said, you know, why does God allow human free will to hurt innocent children? In a sense, why does God allow these things? I haven't got an answer to that one, so I just chuck it in. St. Augustine, the great Christian thinker, said evil was the privation or the perversion of good. So again, examples of that. Food is a good thing, but a poor diet or misuse of food actually is not good for us. Sex is a good thing, but abuse or porn are not good things. Love is good, but possessiveness and jealousy and control are not. So that sense of our choices and our, if you like, our twisting and perverting of God's good gifts are some of the causes of suffering, and the choices people make often inflict mental suffering on others or on themselves, ourselves. And I say that's there really in the biblical account, you know, in Genesis, you know, the original goodness, but it being twisted, distorted, wrong choices made. But alongside that, natural disasters, there's a human element in those, of course, people living in areas prone to floods or hurricanes, and our human choices over years contributing to global warming, making these things worse, more extreme. But there's also things that are completely out of human influence, such as moving tectonic plates, or weather systems. Historically, they were called acts of God, which was probably not good theology. I don't think they are acts of God, but they're part of the way things are made up. I think for some people, extreme suffering and pain can be means of growth. That's something they have to come to, not for us to say. St. Paul says, but we also boast in our sufferings, knowing that sufferings produce endurance. That's Romans 5:3. So something about actually some level of suffering, it can increase our resilience. It's the extreme, it's when it overloads us, if you like, then it actually has the opposite effect. So again, that God can draw good out of ill on occasions. Which kind of brings me to Job's comforters. The book of Job probably started as a sort of old legend of a righteous man who suffers, is tested, and ultimately receives restitution. And that kind of tops and tails the book. But in the great bulk of the book, in the middle, is in effect a long dialogue on the meaning of suffering. So Job, as you know, loses everything, and his friends show up to offer comfort, and they actually start really well. They just sit with him in silence and lament with him. It's when they open their mouths the problems start. And of course, what they're doing is they're not listening to him. They're not starting where he's starting. They come with a particular sort of doctrine in their mind, and it's the idea that was around that the good are rewarded by God and the unrighteous suffer. So if you're suffering, you must be unrighteous by definition. Possibly a modern version of this would be the prosperity gospel. You know, if you're good, you get a lot of money, and if you're not, something wrong. Probably being unkind there. Therefore, they're saying to Job, as he suffers horribly, he must have done major wrong. And this goes on as this long dialogue that goes many, many chapters. But eventually, God speaks, and the comforters are silenced. Their interpretation is wrong, and God is vindicated. So suffering is not a punishment of sin from God. That's one thing the book's saying sort of loud and clear. And Jesus makes a similar point in Luke 13:4, when he says of those 18 who were killed when the Tower of Siloam fell on them, do you think they were worse offenders than any others living in Jerusalem? So they know they're just victims of an accident. But he then goes on to say that something about the state of the whole people that's bringing disaster upon them. And that, again, might be one we could come back to. Sometimes nations, by their actions, can bring judgment and disaster upon themselves. I mean, global warming might be an example of that, and the sufferings that the Russian people seem to be entering into. Job, however, is not given a direct answer, but he's given a total change of perspective. So he's never actually told precisely why he suffers, but what he does get is he suddenly, the whole vision of God's wonder and creation and power, his whole perspective is changed. And then the second thing he gets linked to that is a direct personal experience of God. Before, it was kind of secondhand. He was, doing the right thing, living a good life and saying his prayers. But at the end of the book, he's given this powerful personal experience of God. And that's kind of really significant. That's transforming. Talked a little about meaning making. One just example of this from my past ministry. When I was a vicar in the Midlands, I remember I had a young man with severe back trouble. He'd done manual work. He was quite a sort of well-built, not overweight kind of guy, and he had terrible back trouble. And it went on and on. And he got worse and worse. He was in excruciating pain. Eventually ended up in hospital. And, I saw him and offered care, but I was a bit stumped really to say, you would ask me, where's God in all this? And I really hadn't got an answer. Eventually, he weirdly got the answer from the person in the next bed. And the answer was, you brought this on yourself through, your bad lifting and the way you haven't looked after your back, which was actually worked for the person in the bed next to him, who was kind of alongside him in suffering. Wouldn't have worked for me coming in and sort of patronizingly telling him, oh, you should have been a bit more careful, mate. So it's sometimes it's where we get the answers from, where Jesus speaks into that. And there is something about, I think that in a funny kind of way, that links to the Hebrews, because he himself was tested by what he suffered. He is able to help those who are being tested. Sometimes actually what we can offer is makes more sense if it's coming out of a place of authenticity, that we've had some experience of it. If you like, the wounded healer thing. I think to do that, we need to have had some level of healing ourselves first. A guy called Mark Oatley put it quite neatly. He said, we can't heal out of our wounds, but we can heal out of our scars. That actually that some healing happened enables us to look outwards. Otherwise, we're just playing out our own stuff with people. But actually, the scars remind us of what it was like. Conscious, having had some bereavements myself in recent times, actually how I respond to people who are bereaved, and it's shifted, not majorly, but just a bit, just awareness of how different each grief is. And that's something that's I've kind of learned through having had 3 quite different bereavements. And it's sort of, those things do shape you, and they're things that we can prey upon. But straight after my mum's death last summer, I don't do funerals now because I'm not in parish work, but I wouldn't have felt able to do funerals for about a month or 6 weeks afterwards, because if you like, the wounds are too open. Whereas beyond that, then I was in a place where I think actually that's probably, I can minister better. So authenticity, just keeping an eye on time so I don't overshoot. So we started at 5 past roughly. So if I go on to about 10:40, is that okay? Yeah, that's 5 minutes. Yeah. Christ suffers. The specifically Christian thing is Christ suffers and dies to offer us life. There's various ways of looking at that and interpreting that, but neither the time nor the occasion to do atonement theology. But suffering is part of the Christian journey, and there are times when we're called to share in Christ's suffering. 1 Peter 3, 1 and 2, since Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same intention. And he goes on later in that chapter, beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that's taking place among you, or there's something strange is happening, but rejoice in as far as you're sharing Christ's sufferings. So we are sometimes called to share in suffering. It's part of our discipleship, and that can be persecution, it can be all sorts of different things, but it's there. And Jesus saying about take up your cross and follow me. And we just had Holy Week and Easter. Simon of Cyrene literally has to do that. Take up the cross for Jesus. So where is God? 2 stories from the concentration camps in the Second World War, both not quite, I think, acutely painful ones. First one, there'd been a theft of tools, and a man and a boy were hung for this. The man died quite quickly, but all the inmates were lined up, and there was this boy dangling between life and death because he wasn't heavy. Therefore, he wasn't suffocating quickly for ages. And eventually, someone says, where is God in this? And there's silence. And eventually someone comes back, he's hanging in that noose. So something about God in the suffering. And then the other similar kind of story is Maximilian Kolbe, the Roman Catholic priest, who offered himself in place of those who were due to be executed in a camp. It's because he was single and had no family. They were parents with children, and he wanted, offered himself so they could be there. So something about God suffering on the cross, and also the redemptive suffering, giving it suffering for others, carrying others' suffering, those sort of extreme, and that's possibly where God is. And I think that do just time for a quick screen share the this picture here. The first sight is a sort of gratuitous sort of piece of medieval art. It's called the Eisenheim Crucifix, and actually it was in a hospital, medieval monastic hospital for by the Order of St. Anthony for people with St. Anthony's fire, it was called. It was ergot fungus, and they suffered horrific skin lesions. So they would pray in front of this cross, and here is a cross of Christ with horrific skin lesions. So at one level, it all looks very gratuitous and unpleasant. But what that was is Christ suffering as they suffered, and Christ carrying their sufferings. So it kind of has a purpose, and there's something about Jesus in that with us. And that's there. I won't read it all now because of time running out, but Isaiah 53. One last point. The other Christian response to mental pain, particularly that inflicted by others, is to break that cycle of retaliation. So Jesus on the cross and by his teaching breaks a cycle of responding to suffering, mental and physical, inflicted by others, by inflicting suffering back. So the teaching around turning the other cheek could go the extra mile. That's not necessarily you just take it. It does, you know, one commentator would say turning the other cheek was an act of defiance. But what it's not doing is perpetuating the violence. And so so there is another huge issue, which I just sort of throw in and stop, is where does where does forgiveness come into all this? And another example of that would be Nelson Mandela, you know, years of imprisonment, and came out and worked for reconciliation and inclusion. You know, it could have been quite different, you know, if he'd worked for retaliation and punishment. And a lot in Matthew's account of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, about not harboring anger, loving the enemy. And those are all really challenging, different. In terms of mental pain, it's not perpetuating the cycle. And that's one of the worrying things about Ukraine, of course, is that, you know, it will start a cycle of revenge and violence, and the atrocities will lead to atrocities by the other side. And you get caught in this thing that just goes on and on. So what I've offered is some part answers and suggestions, nothing more than that.